Okay, over to you, Judith. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about an exhibition that I went to see last week at the John Hansard Gallery in Southampton, which it was by Hetain Patel. You might not necessarily be familiar with his work. He's an artist that's kind of he's on an upward trajectory at the moment, I feel. He is a filmmaker. He also makes photographs and sculptures and live installation, live performance. He's London based, but he was born in Bolton. I kind of mentioned that because it's quite interesting the way that he uses languages in his work, and accents, regional accents is one of the things that that makes me smile quite often in his work, because he can change his accent at the drop of a hat. And actually what he does in his work is that he plays with our expectations and preconceptions of people and who they are and what their backgrounds are, and sort of turns things on their head, using language and using humour, and also really relying heavily on elements of popular culture, which he grew up with in the 80s and which are, you know, very familiar, I think, probably to all of us who were around in the 80s. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So the exhibition is called Trilogy, and one of the films is also called Trilogy. No, that's not right. The exhibition is called Trilogy. One of the films is called Trinity. So the kind of threesome thing is very present in the exhibition. So it's 3 films in the exhibition made since 2015, one of which actually won the Jarman Award last year. So that's where he's kind of really starting to take off with his work. He's made quite a lot of little film clips himself talking about his work, and I'm going to show you a couple of those in a minute. And he talks about his obsession with movies and Hollywood and superheroes like Spider-Man and Batman, which are some of his favorites, 2 of his favorites, and also about his love of martial arts, Kung Fu and Bruce Lee. And these are things that feature very heavily in his film work. He was totally obsessed by this sort of thing in his childhood and teenage years. And they really are the mainstays of his film work now. He also talks about how he wants his exhibition at the John Hansard Gallery to be more like going to the movies than going to a gallery. And the work's shown in a sort of cinema style setting on big screens and with surround sound. And there's also a gift shop in inverted commas, which is actually part of the work, part of the exhibition, with posters from the movies and tote bags and t-shirts and even action figures, which is quite interesting, actually, action figures of the characters in his films. So I kind of had an idea of what to expect when I went to see the exhibition, and I was expecting to see those references that I've just talked about. But what I wasn't really prepared for was the intensity of his new work. It's really, really emotionally tense and intense. So yeah, that was unexpected, because his past work that I've seen had been sort of quite humorous and quite a sort of light touch. The first piece of his that I ever saw was a TED talk that he did, which I'd really recommend you have a look at if you have a chance, because I still think that's one of his greatest works. It's called Who Am I? And if you just Google Hetain Patel TED talk, you'll find it, it'll come up straight away. It's too long to show tonight. The first film in the gallery that I saw is a film he made in 2015 called The Jump. And that's the first clip that we're going to show. If you could show that now, Steph. So it's Hetain talking about the making of this film, The Jump. It's only a couple of minutes. Steph, you have to make sure that you've got the sound enabled on your screen share.
So if I've unmuted myself, so basically
that's fine. I think that when we did our test.
Screen now? Is my screen coming up now?
Not yet.
No.
That's funny. Oh, there we go. Desktop. Oh, sorry, everyone. It's saying system preferences and things like that. Right, let me see if that's going to work. That's really funny. It's never done that before. Okay. Is that okay? Can you see that?
That's it. Yeah.
Okay, great. Let me get rid of that and bring it into this.
3, 2, 1, action.
My name is Hetain Patel. I'm an artist and the creator of this film installation, The Jump. The Jump is a set of 2 super slow motion films projected back to back on a screen, usually in an art gallery. And the phantom camera that we used allowed us to slow the action down to 1/100th of real life. So that's 3.5 seconds down to about 6 minutes, which is slow enough that it's almost like a moving photograph rather than a film. It's the first time that I've worked with a film crew and specialist equipment, which kind of upped the ante in terms of production value, which is working towards my ambitions of making my first feature film. We shot in 2 locations, a sports hall, and then largely shot in my grand's living room in Bolton, where most of my family have lived to start with since emigrating to the UK from India 50 years ago. I wanted to return to the first sofa that I've ever jumped off pretending to be Spider-Man and to recreate it in true Hollywood style. So as well as the slow motion, there's a specially made soundtrack by composer Amy May, which makes it feel really epic. And I also made my own Spider-Man costume, sat in my kitchen for 4 months, hand painting a blank morph suit to get it like a movie replica. The film features quite a few of my family members, and I didn't tell them what we were going to do that day. I just asked them to turn up at my grand's house dressed to go to a wedding, and that I was going to bring a camera crew with me. Thankfully, they were all really up for that.
Okay, so we're going to try to do the ladies on the sofas where they will fit, gents at the back, and then people who don't fit.
The work's about taking a leap into the unknown, whether this be my family's migration to the UK or my generation that grew up in the UK and that were kind of eager to step out of those doors and be accepted. You know, I wanted to take the supposed exoticism, the marginality of my family and at home, and to connect it with something widely recognised, a pop culture icon like Spider-Man. I've always been a big fan of Spider-Man. You know, he's one of the few superheroes that covers every inch of his skin, which means that I don't have to be the Indian Spider-Man or the Asian Spider-Man. You know, I can just be Spider-Man.
Thanks, Steph.
Okay.
So we didn't quite get all of the sound coming from that, but we got most of it. At least we could hear what Hetain was saying. There was also, in fact, the musical soundtrack from the film was playing in the background of that clip, but obviously it just didn't come through very well. But oh gosh, it still makes me smile even just to see that little clip actually with him, with all of his family there in his granny's living room, making this fantastic film. And in fact, in the gallery, it's shown in 2 parts. The first part is the bit you saw at the very beginning of Spider-Man sort of taking off into this sort of ethereal backdrop. And this really slow jump, and you don't know how it's going to end, where he's going to land. And then he actually lands on this carpet, his granny's carpet. And then the second part of the film is that all of the family just watching him there jumping off the sofa, but in very slow motion. It tickles me anyway, I like it. But the next film is so different. It's still got those same influences, but it's such a massive move on from The Jump, actually. It's so much more sophisticated and really intense. It doesn't have the same level of sort of humor and lightness of touch in it. And it's called Don't Look at the Finger, which is, I think it's a Bruce Lee thing.
It's about the finger pointing at the moon, isn't it?
Exactly.
It's like, look at the moon, not the finger.
Yes, okay, that's it. So it seems to depict a traditional African wedding ceremony with people in very flamboyant costume. It's very sort of extravagantly filmed. But this wedding ceremony transforms into a strange sort of combat ceremony between the bride and groom. So really tense, with lots of cultural references, lots of different references to language, including sign language, which is the first film where he started to use sign language as one of the gestures of communication in his films. And it's very highly choreographed. And the communication in the film, there's no dialogue, the communication is all by movement, physical movement and gesture, including the sign language. So again, we can watch Hetain talking about the film in a short clip, and then straight after that, Steph, if you could also, we've then got just a little excerpt from the actual film itself.
Okay, sure.
So if you'd like to play both.
And then 3, okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okie dokie.
My name's Hetain Patel. I'm an artist. I'm also the director of this film, Don't Look at the Finger. The film centres around an African wedding ceremony between a man and a woman in a church. It has all the signifiers of what we might recognise as a wedding. But then it becomes something much grander. It becomes really Hollywood. There's big kung fu fight. There's transforming costumes. It takes something quite culturally specific and then starts to mess with that.
We are meeting each other for the first time, so we're quite apprehensive, we're quite shy. As we start to understand and uncover each other's personalities and characters, the way we communicate is out of the extraordinary.
Expect the unexpected. Just learning another vocabulary, another body design is really interesting to know what that conveys and what story that's telling.
We combine wushu, Wing Chun, karate, and we take all of that and fuse it together with sign language to create a new vocabulary, new language to show a ritualistic fight.
It's a unique way of communicating that offers things that other ways of communicating don't. He wants the kung fu to say more, and using sign language, it allows the kung fu to do that. There's a lot of different cultures going into those costumes, and I think that the whole point of them is that they should challenge your expectations.
I'm interested in how we read each other as human beings, whether it's our gender, ethnicity, what we're wearing. And in this film, I'm interested in making interventions and transforming visually and physically those things that we read as identity.
Thanks, Steph. I don't know how everybody else saw that, but unfortunately, from my end, the sound was a bit out of sync with the video, actually. So you don't really get a sense of the drama of the film. So all I can say is that you probably need to go and see it, and it's definitely worth it. But actually, we could also share the links to those films online so that you can watch them afterwards, which might be a nice idea. So the third film, Trinity, is the only one of the 3 films which actually uses spoken language, as well as all of the gestural language that is visible in the other films, in the earlier films. And it also uses sign language, as in the second film as well. And in fact, one of the 3 protagonists of the third film is actually a deaf woman. It's the newest and longest of the 3 films. It's 26 minutes, and this is what Hetain was talking about when he was talking about working towards a feature film, which is his real ambition. And it also has a much more complex narrative than the earlier 2 films, and it's like the second film, though, still really gripping and intense. But it presents a lot of really complex ideas and themes, and really sort of tries to represent, I think, the tensions and the passion and the messiness of life and the contradictions and conflicts that everybody has in their lives. But it's still very heavily influenced by Hetain's passionate interest in this popular culture, in superheroes, in kung fu and martial arts. But what I think he is excited about is that in popular culture, the superheroes are most often men, and they're most often white. But in his films, he turns that on its head, and the 3 protagonists of the last film are female, and none of them are white. I'm not going to actually, Steph, in case you're thinking of lining up the next film clip, I'm not going to show the final one because I think we're probably pretty short on time now, actually. But I think I'll try and share the links with everybody because, you know, people can go and watch them in their own time. One of the things that he talks about, though, is about how showing the 3 films in this exhibition offers the opportunity to open up multiple ideas rather than being limited to a single set of concepts, which you are inevitably limited to if you're only showing one piece of work. And I think that's a really interesting point, actually. I mean, he talks about how the 3 films work as a collection, and that it made him feel much freer and much more willing to take risks with the 3rd work, because by showing them all together and them working together as a collection, he feels that there comes a sort of natural balance through the 3 pieces, which I think is true, actually. And certainly the show as a whole really made me think about a lot of different issues and ideas and concepts, whereas just the being limited to watching one piece of work is inevitably much narrower. I think that's a really interesting thing to take away, actually, because I'm interested anyway as showing work as a collection. And just to sort of finish up, I just wanted to think about the things that I did take away from looking at the exhibition. The obvious issues that are very visible in the work itself about cultural difference, cultural and gender stereotypes, power struggles, I suppose, in relationships, the passion and the violence. I mean, it's really challenging, I think, in that middle film, the physical combat between the man and the woman in this relationship at the wedding ceremony. Also the clashes, I suppose, between tradition and culture and integration, and the use of language, I suppose, the physical as well as the verbal language. And also, if you do manage to get to see the TED Talk, you'll see not just about physical and verbal language, but also about the use of multi languages. And he's very clever in the way that he uses not only English and the sort of dialects and accents in English, but also Gujarati and Mandarin, and he kind of swaps effortlessly between different languages. And things that we might want to think about in our own practices that the exhibition made me think about are about production values and the whole team that's involved in making a piece of work at that kind of level, what's involved in making a film like this, how to achieve it, the collaboration that's needed, working with experts to achieve different results, how to fund it, and also the decisions that we all have to make, I suppose, in our own work about how we make it, whether actually it's important for us to achieve those sort of production levels, or whether actually the work that we want to make demands that we do it in a different, maybe much lower tech sort of way. Maybe the work that we want to make, if it's a film, could be shot on a Super 8 or on an iPhone. But those are always things to think about, aren't they, when you're making a piece of work? And then lastly, I suppose the influence of popular culture in shaping us and in influencing the work that we make. And those decisions again that come into making our work about whether do we embrace popular culture and include it in our work, or do we actually want to reject it and turn our back on it as a sort of statement when we're making our work? So I'll leave those thoughts with you, perhaps.
Thanks, Judith. I guess maybe if there's any questions or comments, it would be a good time to ask or discuss those now before we move on to Cliff. So if anyone has any thoughts on that, if you just want to unmute yourself, Judy, I can see your hand. If you just,
yeah. I just wondered, Judith, what do you know about how he finances that work?
Since he's been on this upward trajectory, he's got multiple funders. And the second film, the one that won the Jarman Award, was commissioned by a gallery. Well, I can't even remember all the different funders, but there are lots of them which actually are referenced at the end of the film. So, you know, if you wanted to see exactly who it is, I mean, I think he's funded by a film organisation, by a gallery, by the Arts Council. And I've no idea what the budget is, but obviously it was big budget and big production values. And
yeah, I was just wondering, because you sort of said, you know, people are doing now fairly ambitious things on their phones, you know, but that's obviously a big step on to have a crew, to have actors, to have experts providing, I mean, the sign language interpreters and all of that kind of stuff. So absolutely, it does become big budget quite quickly, doesn't it?
It does, but it's really interesting, I think, as well, because I think by having all of those people involved, it also must have moved him on in his practice tremendously. You know, how much he's learned by working with all those experts. I think, you know, the more I think about it, the more I think it's so influential when you get to that level where you've got a lot of input into your work, you know, how quickly you can develop and move on.
Yeah, good, thank you.
Are there any other questions, thoughts? Cliff, before we move on to...
just looking at it and looking at the style of it, I thought quite a lot of it seemed to echo some of the stuff that was going on in Matrix and some of the questioning of reality. Did he? Yeah. And the other thing, I thought the use of sign language within it was really very nicely choreographed. The movement between the fighting and the sign language, just weaving the two in, absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, I agree, Cliff. It's really impressive, I think. I think the kind of emotion and passion that is conveyed through the choreography and the gesturing in that film was quite incredible, actually. And it is in the third one as well.
I think sign is underused, isn't it, in terms of providing another layer for language. I did learn it for a while, and I'm completely bloody hopeless at it for some reason, but I just found it absolutely fascinating, and I love to watch it even if I can't work out a word they're saying, basically.
Yeah.
I think Clive had a question, and then we should perhaps move on.
I was going to add in really that the thing that jumped out at me was there's a real link between using sign language and traditional Indian dance, and he was obviously working with, you know, modern dancers, but when they started doing the sign language as well, it just kind of reminded me of very traditional Indian dance and that mixture. So I thought it was lovely.
Yeah, I would highly recommend it if you do get a chance to go down to Southampton. It's a lovely gallery. It's a great place to visit, actually. It's a bit of a trek down there, but I really enjoyed my day there.
That's great. Thank you, Judith. Yeah, lots to think about in there. I'm going to try and see it if I can get over there. Do we want to move on to Cliff, if that's okay? Are you ready to go? How do you want to do this? Shall I? Hopefully I've got screen share. Let me have a look. It says all participants can share their screens. So if that's what you want to do.
Yeah. Excellent. Right, so hopefully now you're seeing a screen that has Holly Hendry invertebrate written on it.
Yep.
Oh, thank you for the nods. I like the nods. I'll just start. I hope the environment that we're in, it's going to be more like moving around a gallery than having me talking, I hope. Well, let's talk to start off with. I'm finding the beginning of my text, I was too focused on what Judith was saying, or appropriately. This work was produced in response to England's Creative Coast launched 7 new artworks by international contemporary artists along the coastline of Essex, Kent and East Sussex. Holly Hendry, one of 7 artists, produced a solo exhibition, an invertebrate, a large sculptural piece for the Warr Pavilion. Her solo exhibition, Indifferent Deep, presents an exploration and interpretation of a selection of the building materials and techniques we use, including reflections on their mass-produced nature. Much of it chewed or penetrated, revealing their inner structure or focusing awareness of visual penetration through the building. The solo exhibition can be seen at least in part as a mock-up the passage of a large invertebrate, a worm. The composite structures makes its way from the roof of the Warr through the first floor and out into the grassed area above the colonnade. You can kind of see it in the background of this image. I say from the roof because while I find nothing I would identify as a head, what is on the roof has distinct qualities of tail. The sense of a directional flow creates the impression of something that has fallen from the sky with the ability to penetrate concrete and steel in its progression seaward. We are viewing these images within a 3D digital space, a digital environment I think of as a studio space, where I can put together, manipulate and explore visual ideas I'm thinking about. I was collecting images to create this and similar spaces when I first came across invertebrate in the process of being constructed. I'm just moving this about in the screen. You can move about this space within VR or just on your screen. You're kind of playing it like a game. I'm hoping you can hear the sea at this point and somebody walking on shingle. You can see we're on the rooftop of the Warr Pavilion at the moment, or within a 360-degree image of the rooftop of the Warr. And we can see this. I hope you can see it works as a kind of worm's tail. But if you visualize it as aluminium, it easily becomes air vents, just one of the many services that we run into buildings. I've actually placed it low in the beach space that we're in, and you can see water coming in at the back, which is the sea, it's representing the sea. And when we look around the inside of the image, we seem to be in an enclosed, almost a private space, but this is an illusion, because if we were in this space with a number of people on the outside could still see in. So we have this kind of visual penetration of that as an image. You can see we're moving along, and we have the sea at a kind of strange level. We're on the beach, but we're also looking at the colonnade, and we can see another view of part of this piece in there. Okay, now this is a view, 360 view of the first floor. With the steps to the roof to the left, you can see invertebrates seemingly penetrating from above and moving on down to rise and then penetrate downward in the grass above the colonnade. You can also see the sea on the horizon and hear and see it penetrating the Warr. again, we have that illusion that we're within an enclosed space, and within that enclosed space, we've got people within the cafe can see through the glass window, but it's the same illusion. Once we move outside of that enclosed space, we can see it as a kind of half a sphere. In this image, you can see I've moved invertebrate onto the beach, or perhaps with rising sea levels, the beach and the sea have moved itself. You can see invertebrate threading its way. I'm pointing at the screen, that's not helping you. You can see it threading its way from the roof. And you certainly get that sense of connection as it moves from the roof and down to the first floor from this angle on the image in the middle. And you can see it in the sand. And when we walk along beaches, the number of times we don't consider actually just how much is underneath that beach and what is flowing underneath our feet. Which does include pipework of that kind of character. Now, there is a soundtrack goes with this one, which is essentially rain and wind. I won't play it at the moment. The Delaware is a steel reinforced concrete building. Concrete is a hydrophilic material. Its many small air pockets create capillary action, drawing water in. Steel, which gives concrete its tensile strength, does not respond well to water, particularly water and salt. Its oxidization can be seen staining the white of this envisaged pristine building. We can also see it staining round this steel part of the sculpture. Sorry, I'll get back. I lost my place. I was looking at the picture. Much work and effort is taken to compensate for this, but seafronts definitely have weather in abundance. The penetration of water into the building and the building's fabric as rain and as wind-blowing sea spray is one element, but it's far from all that nature throws and may throw at it. The twice daily flow of the tide, the sea floats up to the beach, but it also through the shingle. It doesn't stop at the prom, it flows underneath the prom. Much of the property that we see along the seafront is built on shingle. So twice a day, the tide is actually coming up underneath those houses as well. So we have that penetration going on. At the very least, the tidal fluctuation creates changes in the water table underneath what's happening. And as we move into periods of change, with the impact of rising sea level and increased rainflow, all of this unseen movement is going to have greater impact. O rose, thou art sick, the invisible worm that flies in the night, in the howling storm, has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. For many reasons, not the least of which is our current reliance on digital communication, I cannot think of penetration of our buildings, of our lives, without considering digital technology. Widely considered the first computer virus distributed via the internet is what's called Morris's worm, possibly named after Blake's poem. Certainly when I first learned about it years ago, that was the generally held opinion. And it's an early connection I made with this. So when I first saw it and thought about the worm and the idea of penetration, it was one of the ideas that was quite close to the forefront for me. There are so many ways in which our buildings and our lives are penetrated, are for good or bad, interconnected, independent, and so much of it goes unseen. In her writings and interviews about Invertebrate and Indifferent Deep, Holly Hendry talks about penetration and the different ways our building are penetrated and the different things that go in order to do that. She expresses an interest in change and talks about the time that she spent in and around Bexhill getting to know the area before she made the piece. In particular, she talks about going down to the brickworks and looking at the brickworks in terms of it producing the material that was used to build the town. Interestingly enough, of course, the Delaware is concrete, not brick. She didn't talk about digital penetration of our buildings and lives. I suspect the link to a worm as a computer virus is an obscure context. And at that point, I'm going to stop for questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Cliff. I'm just going to hop in there and say that to go back to Heitain's work and thinking of pop culture and films, it made me think of Tremors, that film where there's that like worm-like thing under earth. I don't know if anyone else thought that. I mean, it's quite low brow, but yeah. Okay, so does anyone have any thoughts, questions they want to discuss? Cliff, if you come off the screen share, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
See everyone. Thank you.
Excellent.
Yeah, anyone have anyone else been to see the show and had any other?
I'd like to say Kevin Bacon and Tremors, yes, was there.
Yeah, okay. Good.
Just in case you were sat there feeling, I've said that and nobody knows what I'm talking about.
No, I knew everyone would, but yeah, it's off the wall one to throw in there, isn't it? You know, Matrix is one thing, but Tremors. Yeah, does anyone have any thoughts on like the exhibition? Anything that they you know, those that have been seeing it? I actually haven't seen it. Steph, yeah, if you want.
Yeah, I have seen it, and I really enjoyed it actually, and it was very interesting to see. I like the way that Cliff put his own thoughts into that presentations video. So it was a kind of it was like looking at the exhibition through Cliff's eyes, which was quite interesting. Thank you.
That's great. And Sharon down there, you're just going to unmute yourself if that's okay before you speak.
Okay. Sorry, my fan's going a bit loud. I've seen the exhibition about 3-4 times now, just because I happen to meet various friends there. But I think what's very interesting about her work is her use of materials and the different combinations of quite traditional sculptural materials like plaster and steel, and then you've got like lots of aggregates and sand and MDF, and then the brickwork and these kind of fabrics and things on the outside pieces. It's just quite interesting, that use of like very, very highly mixed media and very evident use of, you know, letting those materials be themselves, not trying to disguise them or anything, but then just being themselves, but also working together to create this kind of strange landscape.
Yeah, it was quite interesting, and one of the many weird things I've done over the years is work with assessment for groups doing construction. So seeing, for instance, the wall taken apart and all of that was very familiar, and yet, of course, presented in a very different way. And in fact, the first morning I came across it when it was being put together, there was a local sculptor was actually sewing up the fabric part, and we talked about tools to help you sew heavy-duty canvas. And I think that thing about those changes in materials and the tools that you use for those materials will become part of the vocabulary that it's using. So yeah, I thought it worked. I've talked to quite a few people about it because I'm down on that part of the beach quite often at the moment. And I talked to a marine engineer about it who didn't like it. But then I got him talking about the materials and that engineering side, and it turned out after being a marine engineer, he'd looked at architecture. So although we didn't like it, we had a very interesting discussion about it in terms of materials, and also in terms of all of the different services and things that we secretly pull in and out of buildings, and how that's managed, which of course is architecturally a huge part of modernist architecture. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, so we'll go back to Steph and Sharon.
I was just going to say, Cliff, what was quite interesting with what you just said, we were at Burling Gap today, and I was looking up at the pipes from under the foundations of the houses that have fallen away, and seeing these pipes coming out of the cliff. And of course, it suddenly reminded me of that exhibition. It's that kind of the unseen bits of our life that are suddenly revealed by the sea are quite astounding, aren't they?
And of course, the drawing posts that are in the middle of that, which is really what I was building this exhibition space for. We don't see most of them until they go and the shingles flowing past them. But also there are numerous points where the streams and various other waters flow out underneath that shingle. So often as you're walking over that shingle, you are walking over pipes. In fact, I happen to know between the sailing club and the cafe place on the beach, there's actually, it's not pipes, but there is ducting because the electricity flows under the shingle between those two. I saw some guys working down there and they're using the spades with the electric installation on. So if you cut through the electric wire, you don't kill yourself. So that constant stuff going on underneath where we're walking, yeah, fascinating idea.
Great, thank you. I think we had one more question from Sharon, and then
yeah, I was just going to say, I thought what was quite interesting was the way she used the space and how your eye was pulled up by pieces of work that were going around the pillars at the top, and then your eyes pulled up to the window, you know, if you're looking down the gallery to the left, and then her sculptures outside take your eye outside, and then there was kind of painted works on the floor. So I thought it was quite sophisticated the way she kind of pulled your eye in all these kind of different directions. So every part of the space was actually very much part of the exhibition. It wasn't just stuff in a room, it was the room was very much part of it as well, the gallery space.
Yeah, there's a lovely point where the window's largely blocked off, but then there's this hole through the window, and then there's another hole, and then she's used one of the windows the other side, so you get this visual penetration comes through from a point where you can see the sculpture behind me out of one window, and you can look up and through. And it got to me personally, because actually through that window I could see a flat that I lived in for a while. So there was this real visual connection between it all. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. And thanks to everyone for commenting on that. I really need to go and see it. So I should go and do that. I guess I'm going to share my screen if that's okay.
Sorry, can I just say one last thing?
Yeah,
I will put, it is a 3D digital space that anybody can visit. I'll put the link to it in the chat, and if you could share it afterwards, that would be brilliant.
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, no problem. Right then. And I was going to say, Judith, I can send the links to the films that you sent to me as well in the chat, so I'll stay on for a bit longer and do all of that. I can't multitask really with typing and on the screen. There we go. Let's see if this works. So can everyone see that okay?
Yep.
Yeah, that's great. I can't see anyone, which is, I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Oh, I need to go backwards. Okay, what's happened there? Oh, I don't want to do that. Sorry, everyone. I'm so out of practice with presentations and stuff. So yeah, so a few weeks ago I went to see the Jean Dubuffet exhibition at the Barbican called Brutal Beauty, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give like a sort of overview of the exhibition and talk a bit about his life as well as his work, and yeah, focus on 3 kind of key themes that kind of came across in the show. I haven't gone through my presentation, I'm just kind of going to speak it, and it'll be good to get your thoughts and perspectives. I don't know if anyone got the chance to see it. It closed a few days ago, and I think it was open for quite a short period of time. I think it was supposed to open in February because of the lockdown. It opened in May, so the run was cut short. So Dubuffet was a French artist who was born in 1901. And I guess the sort of key thing to consider with him is that he enrolled at art school in 1918, but he left after sort of, I think it was only 5 or 6 months. So, you know, he kind of, decided that he wanted to kind of learn through living as opposed to being taught in the academy. But despite leaving art school, he moved in artistic circles and was friends with Andre Masson and Tristan Tzara, people like that. He kind of managed to sort of get himself into like the artistic circles at the time. He worked for the family wine business for a while before finally devoting himself to art in 1942 at the age of 41. So he sort of came to it a little bit later in life. And sort of kind of dipped in and out of kind of working away from art and, you know, kind of coming back to his practice. He had his first solo show in the US in 1947 at the Pierre Matisse Gallery. And yeah, I guess from then on, you know, became like quite a well-known figure, not only in France, but in the US, and had like a series of solo shows throughout the 20th century. He's sort of quite a well-known figure within art history. He had a show at the ICA in London in 1955, and a major retrospective at the Tate in 1966, and that was the last show of his work, like large-scale retrospective of his work in the UK. And so the Barbican show is really sort of, you know, 50 years later, taking on I guess, you know, taking his work and sort of showing it to a new audience. And I'll just say that his work, you know, in the later part of his life, he moved from painting to sort of more like monumental public sculptures as well. And he eventually, he died in Paris in 1985. So that's a little bit of biography about him. And I guess my interest in his work, he's always been like a sort of a figure on the periphery of like my knowledge, my like sort of art historical knowledge. But it comes, I suppose, in an interest in art brut, like raw art, as it's called, translated into English. Art made by those outside the establishment, self-taught artists, I guess art created outside of the boundaries of official culture. So examples could be graffiti artists, the work of, you know, prisoners, children, that sort of thing. So I think, you know, as a young art student, I thought that those kind of that sort of idea was quite interesting. And I went to see the Museum of Everything in London about 11 years ago, and that was really interesting. It showed a lot of work of outsider artists or art brut, and the work of someone like Henry Darger, for instance. So that was kind of an initial interest, and then I was doing a lot of my own work and research into sort of architectural history, and got interested in the work of Alison and Peter Smithson and their beginnings in the independent group of sort of artists, architects, writers in the 1950s in London. And they were influenced by Dubuffet and the art brut concept, I suppose. In 1955, like I said, the ICA organised a show of his work. And I can't remember where I got the reference, but he gave a talk, and his ideas around art brut and his emphasis on materiality influenced the independent group. People like Paolozzi, Nigel Henderson, the Smithsons, the architectural critic and writer Rayner Banham, who coined the phrase the New Brutalism in 1955, referring to the work of the Smithsons. So I guess that's been like a sort of key idea for me in my own research, thinking about the post-war city. So it's quite fitting that the exhibition, Dubuffet's exhibition, went to the Barbican. When we look at that building and that kind of complex, we think of like a sort of series of, you know, sort of brutalist monumental structures. And the first exhibition at the Barbican in 1982 was a group show that included Dubuffet's work, and it was called Aftermath, France 1945 to 55, New Images of Man. So there's a sort of conceptual link in that way. And I also ended up going to the Art Brut collection in Lausanne in Switzerland, because it's literally 5 minutes away from where my sister lives. So I went there in 2015. So I've always had these sort of like links to Dubuffet and yeah, his sort of like practice, but had never really had the time or really spent too much time with his work. So it was kind of good to see that. And that's a picture of Alison and Peter Smithson's Robin Hood Gardens, and that's just an example of their sort of as found aesthetic, which I might talk a little bit about if we've got time. And yeah, there's the man himself. So I'll just say a bit about the exhibition. I'm sure you've all been to Barbican. I suppose that with the building being the way it is, it doesn't really give a lot of flexibility when it comes to the actual exhibition spaces. So you sort of go in and it's room after room after room after room. So sometimes it feels like every exhibition you go and see there seems the same, but I don't know. I hadn't been for a really long time. And, you know, I will say that it was lit beautifully. So what that meant was that pretty much every photograph I took looks really bad. So there are a few of my images in there, but most of them I sort of pulled from the internet or from the exhibition catalogue. Yeah, just to sort of give you an example of the type of work that was in the show. So just to say that the work was presented chronologically. The upstairs galleries were sort of devoted to the earlier part of his practice, and then the downstairs section sort of splits his practice into, you know, sort of there's like a move back to Paris in 1961, I think 1962, which is sort of seen as like a key moment for Dubuffet, and the work sort of the story of his work and life kind of picks up from that point, and it goes on to the latter part of his career. So it's a huge kind of retrospective, but apparently he was really prolific in his work. He made loads, and kind of what was presented in that show was really just a sort of a tiny fraction of what went on. So I guess when looking at the work and the exhibition, I think three kind of key themes stuck out for me in my mind, and they're definitely sort of, I guess, my own personal interests. You know, like I've said before about like architecture, post-war urban spaces, that sort of thing. And I gave a talk a few months ago for Blue Monkey that kind of went into a bit of that in detail. But I guess we go back to Dubuffet, and I think the first theme I'm just going to briefly talk about is materials and matter. And I was just thinking about like the comments made about Holly Hendry's work and also Hetain Patel's work, thinking about like with Holly Hendry's, like the sort of idea of like materials, materiality, plaster, steel, aggregate, and then Hetain's interest in pop culture. And I think those two things are real, like were key for Dubuffet. And yeah, so again, so I'll sort of talk a bit about that in a while. But yeah, so talking about materials, so this is a photograph that you can see by Robert Doisneau of Dubuffet in his studio in 1951. It's in the exhibition, quite large, blown up, and it's sort of the artist presenting himself as a sort of alchemist with materials around him. He mixes paint with substances like gravel and tar, sand, coal dust, pebbles, etc., shards of mirror. And there's a film in the gallery of sort of archival footage, or there was a film in the gallery that shows him sort of scavenging and rooting around in bins and things like that, picking up kind of detritus from the side of like railway lines and things like that. So I kind of see that as him sort of like, you know, he's kind of wanting to represent something that's like a lot more real and like rooted in the everyday. I can't remember what is the next slide. Oh yeah, that's That's a piece called The Abandoned House from 1952, and that's in the exhibition. It's, as you can see, it's kind of like really layered up oil paint, you know, kind of looks like the surface of the moon, talking about the moon earlier in our conversation. And I guess that context for this interest in the sort of like the raw and the as found kind of quote the Smithsons was the post-war context and this idea of kind of processing the horrors of the Second World War. And to quote the exhibition curator Eleanor Nairn, you know, these kind of atrocities had made, quote, academic easel painting look at best polite and at worst obsolete. So I think he was looking for a style and a way of kind of art making that represented life as he saw it in that moment. But you know, his experimental approach won both admirers and detractors. So there was a lot of protest of his early exhibitions. And just kind of go through that. So you've got The Abandoned House, and then that's a piece called The Extravagant One. So that's him using enamel paints, and I did take a photo of it, but it's just come up so badly on my phone. But there's a real like luminosity, if that's the right word. Like the paintings are really luminous, the colors really come out, and the way they were lit in the show really kind of, yeah, just really sort of focused you to that. And the walls were painted blue, and it really had this kind of like, yeah, it's like kind of strange, yeah, like feeling towards it, like looking at it. And these are some small sculptures, and apparently these aren't really shown that often because they're really fragile, and the footage of him kind of like scavenging in bins and railway lines are sort of made from the pieces he found made, you know, he made these kind of small sculptures from them. So there's remnants of a burnt car, silver foil and driftwood, lava, paper mache, cork root, that sort of thing. So the sort of very small one at the bottom of the screen is cork root there. And I guess, yeah, they're just sort of quite fascinating for me, you know, sort of only really knowing his paintings. And then just to sort of lead on from the kind of material aspect, to go on to talk about the butterfly collages that he made in 1953. So between 1955 and 1961, he moved to the south of France for his wife's health, and he would go out on walks, butterfly catching, and he'd use the wings to form the basis of collages, and would use watercolor to sort of like you know, make the colors sort of stand out a bit more. So he moved away from using the like sort of cement and bitumen towards a more sort of like delicate, precise, you know, use of as found materials, if you want to say that. So a writer went to visit him in 1956 and wrote, "Dubuffet is here in a flowery hat and socks with green polka dots. He no longer paints with butter, cement or bitumen, but with shoemaker's glue." So it was sort of commented at the time, his sort of turn towards different type of materials. And I guess the emphasis on texture, on the emphasis on texture and materiality, and an insistence on the real, as opposed to sort of artifice, again comes back to this context in which he was working in, acknowledging human failings, I guess, after the atrocities of the Second World War, and you know, starting again from the ground up. So sorry, just see people chatting there. Okay, so the next, moving on to the next sort of theme that really kind of struck out to me was ideas around the city and everyday life. So he was really inspired by Brassai's photographies of Parisian street graffiti that he made between 1935 and 1956. And there's an example here on the screen, and they actually have a couple of examples of of his photographs in the exhibition. So the wall sort of becomes this like space of kind of almost like primal expression in which anyone can lay claim and activate. And I also found links with the Situationist International and the sort of May 1968 movement, and beneath the streets, the beach, that kind of famous slogan of like Parisian street graffiti. So Dubuffet would walk the streets of Paris in search of graffiti, and it also reminded me of the work of Nigel Henderson, who I said was influenced by Dubuffet to an extent, and that's a Henderson piece. So he would also do a similar thing. He would, you know, go on what's been quoted as peripatetic wanderings of the East End, looking for kind of examples of graffiti and street life, essentially. And then kind of moving forward, thinking about the work of Jean-Michel Basquiat, who, you know, obviously there's a kind of direct link with like Dubuffet's work in that sense. So he used lithography. Yeah, that's right. Lithography is a way of sort of exploring this interest in graffiti. And he would like scratch onto the stone and create like a graffiti-like effect with the work. And I can't remember what that was. I did have that written down, but I don't. And so he did a whole series called The Walls, of which this is from. And I think it was part of a book illustration, I'm not quite sure. And then he did another series of work called The Messages, and they were sort of scrawled messages over sort of newspaper, German, French newspaper, thinking about the sort of time, you know, sort of immediate post-occupation during the war. Yeah, so scrawled fragments, layering and collage. And these are sort of from his very early stages of his kind of return to his practice in the 1940s. Yeah, and the focus on wars and graffiti, as I said, he sort of devoted to his, you know, his ideas to the unexpected traces of life, you could say, reflecting a belief that, to quote Dubuffet, the very basic scribbles traced on a wall with a knife point have more belief than have more precious meaning than most large pretentious paintings. So he kind of creates this like dichotomy between like high and low art, and he kind of wants to break down the hierarchy. So why should one be placed above the other? And then to kind of move forward in time, as I said, he had a break from Paris and returned in 1961, having been in the south of France for 6 years. And it was like a completely different city, essentially. If what we saw before was sort of like black and white, bombed out spaces, you know, where, you know, there's still a lot of hardship and people kind of just getting over what's happened to them. You've got, you know, sort of like pop consumer culture emerging in the 1960s. You can think of parallels happening in London and other places. So it was a rapidly changing city. The population had grown. The post-war period of economic boom created like a new consumerist society. And it reminded me of a novel that I read years ago called Things, A Story of the 60s by Georges Perec, which some of you probably know of or have read, which kind of focuses on sort of like, yeah, contemporary French consumer culture of the 1960s and a young couple that are sort of obsessed with identifying themselves through what they own as opposed to like sort of other ways. So this kind of post-war boom alongside huge infrastructure projects like the Tour Montparnasse and the post-war banlieue suburbs, the sort of, you know, big tower block projects, changed not only the look but the feel and the sense of the city. So we move from this sort of like post-war black and white to mid 20th century colour. And what Dubuffet, his response to this was creating his Paris Circus series, and the one you can see in front of you is called Paris Montparnasse from 1961, and it's oil on canvas. So you know, the scenes of city life are sort of flattened out on the picture plane, and you know, it sort of lends itself to kind of like disorientating image. You know, you're sort of kind of like imagining yourself back in a city. And for me, going back into London for the first time in nearly 2 years because of lockdown, it was quite disorientating to be back in that space. I mean, it's hard to tell whether it was like a critique or a celebration of that sort of consumerist post-war life. But it's full of people, and the work is completely different from some of his earlier pieces, and I've not shown them, but there's a piece called, there's a whole series called Texturology, which he basically sort of tries to paint paint soil. They're really kind of fascinating pieces to look at. So that's kind of another idea, key theme within the exhibition and within his practice, this idea of like the city, this idea of like real life. And then sort of moving on to the final part of, not the final part of the exhibition, but the kind of final theme I'm going to talk about, which is obviously Art Brut and his sort of relationship to Art Brut, which I guess, some people might think could be slightly problematic, especially with terms like outsider art, etc. But it was a term coined by Dubuffet in 1945 to describe the work made by those he saw as, quote, untouched by artistic culture. And again, it goes back to this idea of there being like a distinction between those like formally trained and those that haven't had any art training. And he was influenced by a book called The Artistry of the Mentally Ill that was published in 1922 by a German writer called Hans Prinzhorn. And when he uses the term Art Brut, like I said, it's a sort of self-taught artists, psychiatric patients, graffitiists, prisoners, tattooists, spiritualists, etc. And between 1945 and 51, he spent time researching, collecting and exhibiting Art Brut in Paris, including trips to Switzerland with Le Corbusier as well. And then the collection went to the US for ages, and then returned back to Paris in 1962. And it kind of reignited, along with his move back to the city, it kind of reignited his interest in Art Brut, and he started collecting like avidly again. And it also prompted the start of like a new series of works for him, the Orloop series. I don't know if I've said that right. And it was basically like a sort of creation of like a sort of immersive world, for himself and the viewer. So it was sort of like paintings. I haven't got any photographs of it now. Paintings, performances, everything. The series started as like a doodle on the back of a piece of paper while he was on the phone. And yeah, just an example, that's Aloïse Cobaz, the artist, that's called Napoleon III at Cherbourg, 1952 to 54. So she was diagnosed with schizophrenia. So she's a psychiatric patient. She basically worked in secret and worked with pencil and ink, and then sort of destroyed everything. And it was only when she came to the attention of one of her doctors that the work, she was introduced to Dubuffet, and the work was then given like sort of, more permanent home. He called her, he was really struck by the work, praising her great mastery over the mise-en-page. And then Madge Gill, another artist in the collection, who I'm sure many people might know. She had a show at the Nunnery Gallery in London quite a few years ago, and she was born in Walthamstow in 1882, and that piece is called Untitled, and it's quite large actually. If I just go, you can probably get a better sense of it there. That's in the actual Barbican show. And when he returned to Paris, he basically rented a large room, he bought a large house to house the Art Brut collection, and was able to sort of buy much larger scale pieces like that one because he now had a space to put them in. So I suppose the Art Brut connection, it was deeply linked to his own practice, although he would never call himself like an outsider artist in any way. But it sort of helped him intellectually, I think, to sort of form ideas of like artistic dissent, and sort of put himself as like a distant artist. And I should also say that some of his kind of political views were controversial. I'm not going to go into it, but yeah, it's sort of the exhibition referenced them in passing, but not so much. He kind of saw himself as a bit of an anarchist, I suppose, and it allowed him to kind of like unlearn a lot of these traditional techniques that he said were sort of not representative of real life, etc. So I guess I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to stop the screen share. I guess that it's been really good for me to kind of dip into his work and talk a bit about my personal interest in those things. I don't know if anyone saw the show or have any ideas or thoughts they want to bring to what I've just been talking about. Thank you. Yeah, hi Clive.
Really, really fascinating, actually, Steph. Thank you, because some of the early stuff when he was early in your talk, I didn't catch the date, when he was like layering lots of different things. Just it reminded me of the Ansel Kiefer work that I just absolutely love, and that approach I only discovered and saw, I don't know, about 3 or 4 years ago, and it was like, wow, what is this stuff? You know, it was just brilliant. And I don't think Kiefer would have been able to have done that had Dubuffet not been doing that kind of thing earlier, unless they were contemporaries. But I think Kiefer's later. I don't know enough about it. But that texture and the focus on the real things, and also a kind of a response to the wars, the 2 world wars. I just thought it was fascinating. Really,
yeah, I
didn't
hadn't
know
thought,
stuff at all.
oh no, I hadn't really thought about the Kiefer link. I think that Kiefer, maybe someone knows that's much more informed than me. I have a feeling he was slightly later, but not much later.
But in France as well. So
pardon?
And in France. So
I don't know. I thought he was German, Kiefer, but maybe he was working.
Yeah,
I don't know. Maybe, or you know, artists get everywhere, don't they? But yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, you know, Dubuffet has been a highly influential figure to a lot of artists, you know, at the time, and you know, like Basquiat and Keith Haring. And I didn't really focus so much on like some of his later paintings that are really quite like cartoonish in their style. And, you know, you can also kind of place that within the like tradition, like the kind of French cartoon tradition, can't you, with a sort of like black and white outline, that sort of thing. You know, so yeah, but I mean, I also loved Kiefer as well years ago, so yeah, so maybe there's like a sort of like subliminal link there between that style of work and the kind of layering. Thank you. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add. I know we've gone slightly over. Yeah, hi Kath, do you want to? Yeah.
Well, I was also thinking about Kiefer, and but a feeling that Dubuffet didn't really come out of the comparison very well. I felt that all his work was very cartoonish. So the fact that we didn't even see the later stuff that you describe as cartoonish, I'm quite glad I didn't take the trouble to go to the exhibition. I love a bit of brutalism, but brutalism as an in its architectural manifestation, which is how I think about it, seems to me to be very serious and cerebral. And I'd never really thought about the connection with, to use a sort of loose phrase, painting before. So I think that's something I'm going to take away, is to look at the connections that people like Peter and Alison Smithson had with visual artists.
Yeah, I think it's really key to kind of, I think that what's happened to the word brutalism now is it's been sort of commandeered by sort of like contemporary visual culture as this sort of like catch-all term for anything made out of concrete, and that just wasn't the case. So I get really annoyed when people call the Barbican brutalist, because yes, it is if you see it in those terms, but the Barbican was built finally and opened in like 1982. It was a massive project. It was like speaking of an architectural vocabulary much earlier, you know, of that kind of post-war moment. But yeah, when Rainer Banham, who was an architectural writer and Smithson's associate, Palozzi associate, that sort of thing, you know, coined the term New Brutalism, it was in reference to art brut, you know, like it was raw, like concrete in the raw. And you know, it's really hard to sort of pin down. I didn't really define it, but the Smithsons and I suppose Palozzi, they had this kind of idea that like the post-war city somehow represented this kind of more like genuine existence, and they were kind of drawn to like street life, children's art, like scrawlings, like chalking on the pavements, that sort of thing. And it would, I suppose it really came out of that like what are we left with, particularly in like somewhere like London, when you've kind of another sort of cities that had been like affected by the war and had been bombed, etc. But yeah, so it does have a link, because I suppose I know what you mean. There was like, it was almost like the artist is, it's almost like it's two halves to the show. Like there is this kind of like cartoonish, quite garish aspect. But yeah, it's yeah, no, there is a link. So yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
I've got Raina Badham's book somewhere.
Oh, you? Yeah, yeah. Yes, Steph, you were going to say something.
I was just going to ask a question. Actually, it's for Clive, and I wondered if there's a kind of a musical equivalent of the brutalist movement. I can't hear you, Clive.
Oh yeah, I don't know about. I mean, I suppose that the classic thing would be to say music concrete, wouldn't it? Which is, you know, just taking stuff. But whether that's me getting hung up with concrete and concrete, I don't know. I can't name anybody in particular. I mean, maybe some of the very early Stockhausen, before he got so spiritual, maybe some of that was quite harsh, but I don't know, because in brutalism has a real beauty as well.
Yeah. I mean, is it jazz? Is there a kind of jazz link? Because Paolozzi was very into jazz, wasn't he? So is that a kind of, is there some sort of mix there? I don't know. I'm not very musical.
I've got a feeling that all the things that were going on in the middle of the 20th century, which is kind of the period that I am fascinated by in visual art and also in music, they all do talk to each other, and they all do build on the sort of post-Picasso thing for me. But I don't know much about visual art, so I'm probably talking totally out of context here.
I can't answer the question about the musical equivalent, but I'm sure there is one, you know. And I think that the more you dig, the more the links come about, and you start to make connections that perhaps you hadn't thought of before. So yeah,
I get Ligeti was always taking, you know, clusters, blocks of sound, and most people would know his stuff from, you know, 2001: Space Odyssey and stuff like that. But those clusters of sound are very, very beautiful, and yet that is doing, I think, orally what brutalist art seems to do, from as far as I can see.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. I hadn't even thought about the musical side of that. If I don't know if anyone has any more thoughts or wants to pitch in. I'm aware we've gone really over time, probably me waffling on. So unless there's anyone else, I'm going to bring our meeting to a close and say thank you for joining us. Thanks to Judith and Cliff for presenting on their two exhibitions. And like I said, our next talk is on the 23rd of September. Keep an eye out for whether it's in person, hopefully, or out of or back on Zoom, sorry. And yeah, and I hope everyone has a good rest of the summer, and thanks again for coming, and we will see you all soon, hopefully in person. Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.